On this Wednesday night, the state of emergency on a Manitoba Cree Nation. The crisis enveloping the community and the pleas for help as Manitoba's Indigenous Affairs Minister quits. COVID's resurgence in the U.S., what it could mean for the border.
Nobody wants to have to go backwards.
Plus, the debate about whether to mandate vaccines for students. The EU says it's now or never its ambitious pledge to be carbon neutral. Plus, sounds from the deep.
Just such a risky proposition.
What a Canadian researcher recorded in the deepest known point of the world's oceans.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin tonight with a tragic situation unfolding on a northern Manitoba First Nation. The Tataskweyak Cree Nation is asking for help and has declared a state of emergency because of recent deaths and incidents of self-harm. The community of Split Lake is about 700 kilometers north of Winnipeg. About 2,300 people live there. And in a news release, the First Nation says we have reached a breaking point and our community is under crisis with alcohol and drugs contributing to it. The community has reached out to mobile crisis teams and is asking for additional support from Health Canada, Indigenous Services Canada, the RCMP, and the province of Manitoba. It says it needs long-term solutions, such as 24/7 in-community mental health counseling. The First Nation is also dealing with a water emergency. It's been under a drinking water advisory since 2017 and has launched a class action lawsuit against the federal government over that. Our chief political correspondent, David Akin, reached the chief of that Cree Nation. David, what else did she tell you?
Right, and that chief is Chief Doreen Spence, and we did speak this afternoon, her and two of her band counselors, and she really talked about a community that really became completely overwhelmed by a mental health crisis. Here's some of what she had to say.
Everybody's hurt and in disbelief of what's happening to our young people, and this is a wake-up call for us too, that we have to do something to help our people.
Now, as I mentioned, Chief Spence spoke to me with two of her band counselors, and they wanted to stress that the whole council, the community, very much behind this decision to declare an act of emergency. And it's for a mental health crisis, the kind of crisis they've never seen in their community before. They have 9 deaths by suicide in the last 14 months. And it is all young people, people between the age of 15 and 19. It's a community of 2,300, 2,600, depending at the time. Like many small towns, perhaps across Canada, they simply didn't have the resources to deal with this kind of mental health crisis, and that's why they have reached out for help.
We're in a desperate situation here right now. We don't want to lose any more youth, and so we need anyone out there that is willing to help our community contact us in terms of what they can support.
Now, alcohol and drug abuse, absolutely the common denominator with all these deaths and with some continuing problems in the community, but it's more than that. Certainly the lockdowns associated with the pandemic have contributed to the mental health crisis. And that's just not in that community, but in many communities across the country. Another big contributing factor, the chief telling me today and the counselors, is the discovery of the unmarked graves at residential schools across the country. This has been a punch in the gut, not just to elders in that community, but to Indigenous youth in this particular community as well. That is contributing to the crisis. So they've reached out for help. They have some initial contacts with the federal government. They're hoping to hear more about getting more resources into the community as quickly as they can to reverse this crisis. Donna?
So much intergenerational trauma. David Akin in Ottawa, thanks. There is some support for those who need it. The Canada Suicide Prevention Service line is available in Canada 24 hours a day. The number is toll-free. You can speak in confidence. 1-833-456-4566 is the number. Manitoba's Minister of Indigenous and Northern Relations has resigned after comments Premier Brian Pallister made last week. Eileen Clark isn't commenting on exactly why she quit the cabinet. Last week, Premier Pallister chastised people involved in tearing down statues of Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth on the grounds of the Manitoba Legislature on Canada Day and said the statues will be restored.
We need to respect our heritage, just as we need to respect one another. not to find fault, not to tear down, not to highlight every failure, but rather to realize that we're a complex country as we are made up of complex people. The people who came here to this country before it was a country and since didn't come here to destroy anything. They came here to build. They came to build better.
When asked about those comments today, Brian Pallister said this.
I'll stand by my comments. I continue to advocate that we build and not destroy, and I'll continue to say that we can work together, and when we do, we'll accomplish great things.
Pallister was asked what reason his cabinet minister, Eileen Clark, gave him for stepping down. He refused to comment. Clark also declined to say anything out of respect, she says, for the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs election, which is happening today. Now to some breaking news out of Toronto. City Council there has voted in favor of renaming Dundas Street and other Toronto landmarks bearing the Dundas name. The push to rename the street gained traction last year when thousands of people signed a petition during anti-racism protests. The street was named after Henry Dundas, an 18th century Scottish politician who helped delay Britain's abolition of slavery. The city says it will begin consultations on choosing a new name. Well, schools are already planning for the fall, and there is growing debate around whether vaccinations should be mandatory for students and staff at post-secondary schools. More than half of Canadians are fully vaccinated, but when it comes to people aged 18 to 29, only 21% have both shots. As Mike Drolet reports, schools may have a tough decision to make.
It's a Canadian post-secondary first. If you want to attend Seneca College in person in the fall, be prepared to show proof of a COVID-19 vaccine. Otherwise, stay online.
We're not forcing anybody, actually. We're actually not making vaccines mandatory. We're saying if you want to come on campus, you must be vaccinated.
It's a decision Seneca President David Agnew says he made with the safety of his students in mind.
Honestly, I would love government to come in and say these are the rules of the road, because that makes it easier for everybody. But we can't wait.
And the Ontario government doesn't appear to be in a hurry, declining to give a firm answer to Global News on its plans. As far as immunizations go, only Ontario, New Brunswick, and recently BC have required students to be vaccinated against childhood illnesses. Epidemiologists see COVID-19 as a logical addition to that list.
This is this herd immunity notion, right? You have a war, people get vaccinated. All you need is some not to be vaccinated, and the virus sneaks through. So the notion of, well, I don't need to be vaccinated because I'm going to be okay, it's ridiculous. Protect us, get this wall up so we'll get down to zero coronavirus and we can get on with life.
Yet it's a debate with seemingly no middle ground. It's either a question of public health or individual rights. Western University says students must be vaccinated to live in campus dorms this coming school year. Others may follow. In the U.S., schools have been quicker to act. More than 500 post-secondary institutions, including Harvard and Berkeley, have already committed to mandatory student vaccinations.
You know, the social fabric of the United States and Canada is similar, but boy, it sure isn't identical. And, we're looking at this through a Canadian lens of how we view our own rights and responsibilities. So in some ways, it's not that surprising that Canada's struggling with this one.
It's an issue, he says, worthy of debate. But halfway through July, how much time do we have? Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
In the U.S., a spike in COVID-19 cases is making the reopening of the Canada-U.S. border more uncertain. Cases are nowhere near what they were at the peak, but they are climbing fast. In the last 2 weeks in Florida, cases jumped 257%. Public health experts say the highly transmissible Delta variant and pockets with low vaccination rates are to blame. Jackson Proskow reports.
Months of progress have been wiped out in just a few short days. The highly contagious Delta variant is spreading rapidly in the U.S. Case numbers are climbing in 45 out of 50 states.
It's looking different. It's feeling different. We're seeing the increase in transmissibility that we know is characteristic of the Delta variant.
It's happening fastest in communities with low rates of inoculation. In Mississippi, where just 33% of the population is fully vaccinated, the surge has left 7 children in intensive care. 2 are on ventilators. Hospitals in Missouri have reopened their COVID wards. 99% of those requiring treatment are not vaccinated.
In this phase of the pandemic, there's really two life choices. It's to vaccinate or you're going to get COVID.
Los Angeles County has reported more than 1,000 cases per day each of the last 5 days and is once again recommending masks even for the fully vaccinated.
I think we have to be very, very cautious. We're at a tipping point right now. This variant is taking hold. It's becoming dominant. It's extremely contagious.
The renewed U.S. surge could complicate the long-awaited reopening of the Canada-U.S. border.
We are not through this pandemic yet.
Current restrictions are likely to be extended before they expire next week. Ottawa wants 75% of Canadians to be fully vaccinated first and has warned further easing depends on how the virus evolves.
As eager as people are to open up, I know nobody wants to have to go backwards.
Back in the U.S., the CDC is now predicting an increase in hospitalizations and deaths for the first time since the spring, as experts warn of the potential for new variants to emerge in the mix between vaccinated and unvaccinated Americans.
We've left the door open for the virus to learn everything it needs to get around that vaccine that we desperately worked so hard to get.
Jackson Proskow, Global News, Washington.
In Kelowna, BC, the body of a fifth person who died when a construction crane collapsed has now been recovered. Part of the crane landed on a building where a man was working. 4 construction workers were also killed. Robin Gill is in Kelowna, and she spoke to the father of one of them.
Chris Vilnius had to see for himself the place where his son died.
Our family's close. I've got 4 kids, and you take one out of the equation, it takes away from the dynamic of your family.
It was 23-year-old Kaylin's first day on the job when a crane crumbled, sending pieces of steel crashing down.
They asked him specifically to take down the crane, so when I saw the crane down, I knew he was on the crane, and he thought the worst.
The family can't stop looking at this video taken of the crane as it was being removed, desperate to understand what went wrong. That's Kaylin on the left. He'd worked for Stemmer Construction before and was excited about coming back for the new job. The BC company is family-run and has been since its founding in 1990. It was a subcontractor on a Kelowna high-rise under construction. The founder lost his own 2 sons, Eric and Patrick Stemmer. Patrick was the crane operator. Jared Zook from Edmonton was also killed.
This would be the worst structural collapse that I've responded to.
A team of firefighters from Vancouver helped recover a 5th man who was working in a building next to the one under construction. Crews say he didn't stand a chance when the crane hit.
The objects from the crane had come through the roof, and the roof was essentially completely gone.
Global News requested information about Stemmer Construction's safety record, but the provincial agency in charge says it will take days at minimum for our questions to be answered. The union representing engineers in construction is demanding more oversight of crane operators.
It's critical that people are skilled and trained to be able to do the work. It's the most critical part of the process, dismantling or erecting the tower crane.
Chris Vilnius, himself a construction manager, has questions about how this tragedy could have happened. But he needs to deal with his grief first.
You can't even put it in your brain, or don't even want to. The feeling that comes across you when you get the news, it's just unbelievable.
Now, 2 cranes have been brought in to stabilize the situation and somehow figure out how they're going to remove the one that's at the center of the investigation. But even investigators can't get access to the scene, so it could be weeks, possibly months, before we find out what went so wrong, Donna.
All right, Robin Gill in Kelowna, BC, thanks. A promise for the planet coming up, how the EU plans to be carbon neutral by 2050. The crisis in the Canadian military and all the allegations of sexual misconduct have made headlines for months. At the same time, there's been a steep increase in the number of people submitting claims for a class action lawsuit against the government. As Abigail Bimman reports, it appears people are becoming more comfortable coming forward.
It wasn't until I
got into therapy that I realized how much the 80s assaults actually affected my life.
Sam Samplonius's military career began 40 years ago. She says she was sexually assaulted 3 times in the 1980s, then again in 2016.
It's been emotional. It's certainly affected my family. I'm now divorced.
While she personally had to withdraw from the class action lawsuit to pursue a civil case against her alleged abuser, she attributes a recent spike in claims to a positive culture change.
They're realizing that their feelings are valid. The traumas that happen to them are valid. And I think now that people really understand that people will believe them and not look at them as some sort of weirdo.
The class action opened to claims in May 2020. By December of that year, there were nearly 3,000 of them. Now there are well over 7,000 claims. That's a 170% spike in 6 months. There are still 4 months left to submit a claim.
There's a presumption that the stories and the narrative, the experiences that people relay will be accepted as being true. People won't be questioned. They won't be interviewed. There's no expectation that they previously raised these issues.
One lawyer working on the lawsuit says they've worked to make the process non-adversarial and they pass along any issues they hear.
Suddenly receiving an email that says, hey, congratulations, your sexual harassment or sexual assault allegations are recognized as real. And this is extremely traumatic for some people.
Those close to the class action tell Global News while the process can be emotional, one claimant called it excruciating, there's also a tremendous amount of healing that comes through it, all hoping that separate from the payout of up to $900 million, this will create real and lasting change going forward. Abigail Bimman, Global News, Ottawa.
Still ahead, Canadian soldiers lament the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. The U.S. government says it will get a group of Afghans who worked with American forces out of the country. Their lives are at risk if they stay, and Canada, too, has been under pressure to give safe haven to Afghans who worked with our troops. The Taliban are regaining more control of the country every day. And as Mike Armstrong explains, Canada's top soldier is speaking out.
This is a Taliban video shot this month at the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. It's a spot called the Friendship Gate. The Taliban flag now flies over it. In 2007, a global national team visited the same spot. Afghan border police controlled the crossing with the support of Canadian troops and equipment provided by NATO. Seeing places like the Friendship Gate fall has been hard on the soldiers who tried to help. Canada's acting Chief of the Defence Staff released an open letter Tuesday night to serving and retired soldiers. In it, he says the fall of areas Canadians fought to protect, quote, has hit many of us particularly hard. The current trajectory of the country leaves us with much pain and doubt. The goal of Lieutenant General Wayne Eyre's letter was to help soldiers who served in Afghanistan who may be struggling hearing the news of Taliban advances. He tells the troops to focus on their commitment to service, to honor the sacrifice, and to reach out if they need support.
We're watching these scenes. We were there.
Retired soldier Chris Dupuis says watching the news lately has been like a punch in the gut. Seeing people he tried to help now back under the thumb of the Taliban.
Seeing the families fleeing and getting shot at, that's really, really disheartening and heartbreaking.
President Bush, you have
now, there is new criticism of the U.S. decision to pull out of Afghanistan. In an interview with a German broadcaster, former President George Bush says progress has been made and will be lost.
Sadly, I'm afraid Afghan women and girls are going to suffer unspeakable harm.
Is it a mistake, the withdrawal?
I think it is.
The United Nations Refugee Agency says violence has forced hundreds of thousands from their homes just since January, and getting aid to them without a peace deal is getting more and more difficult. The Taliban advances make that peace deal less and less likely. Mike Armstrong, Global News.
The European Union has laid out a plan to drastically cut greenhouse gas emissions, saying the world is at a now or never moment. The EU plan includes tighter emissions limits for cars, effectively ending sales of new gas and diesel cars by 2035, introducing a carbon tax on aviation and shipping fuel, and a carbon levy on non-European manufacturers who'd have to pay more to import materials like steel and concrete.
And the principle is simple. Emission of CO2 must have a price on CO2 that incentivizes consumer, producers and innovators to choose the clean technologies, to go towards the clean and sustainable products.
The aim is to wean Europe off fossil fuels through strict policies rather than be forced into desperate measures sometime in the future.
There is no time to waste. People are dying in northwest Canada because it's 50 degrees Celsius there. Northwest Canada. Siberia reaches temperatures over 35 degrees. Central Europe is over 40 degrees. We saw tornadoes in the Czech Republic. Who would ever have thought of that? So anyone who wants to deny the urgency of the climate crisis should look again.
The plan has to be passed by the European Parliament. It would impose legally binding targets to reduce net EU emissions by 55% by 2030 from 1990 levels and eliminate them by 2050. Deep sound waves next, when a Canadian recorded 11 kilometers under the sea. A Canadian researcher has recorded audio from the deepest part of the ocean. It's an amazing achievement. The Mariana Trench is one of the most extreme environments on Earth. The equipment that went down had to withstand intense pressure. And as Ross Lord reports, the secret sound of the sea floor is finally surfacing.
For oceanographer David Barclay, sending a high-tech gizmo to the deepest part of the world's oceans was a success, in part because his research equipment even survived the trip.
There's always only a half expectation that we'll get the equipment back because it's just such a risky proposition sending it down there.
Barclay's research in April was centered at a section of the Mariana Trench called the Challenger Deep. At 11 kilometers down, water pressure is so intense there it would destroy many normal scientific instruments. His lander is one of few to successfully complete the research, using sensors to measure water temperature, salt content, and sound.
So we want to measure the water properties throughout the entire range of ocean depth,
including only the second audio recordings ever from the Challenger Deep. Some of the early sounds were unnerving. Shards of glass chipping off from the lander. At the very bottom, near total silence in one of the quietest underwater locations on the planet, but for the ripples of waves breaking tens of thousands of meters above. The lander was recovered, data intact, providing Barclay and his colleagues with an opportunity to analyze its findings.
to understand how does the human use of the ocean impact the acoustic environment of the open ocean.
Barclay says he's already begun developing a model that can predict ocean properties far beneath the surface, findings that could lead to better nautical charts for mariners and a more detailed map of the sea floor itself. New efforts to understand our planet and the oceans that cover most of it. Ross Lord, Global News.
And that is Global National for this Wednesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, one of only 2 urban communities in North America designated a UN World Heritage Site. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.